Can emotional worship replace biblical clarity? Hello, I'm Pastor Marvin McKenzie. Now, this is an important question because that's exactly what's happening in a lot of places called church today. Now, before anyone panics, this isn't an attack on joy or passion or heartfelt worship. The Bible commands us to rejoice. The Bible records tears, shouting, singing, and praise. But here's the issue. Emotion was never meant to replace understanding, and when it does, the church doesn't get stronger, it gets weaker. Paul saw this coming, and that's why he wrote 1 Corinthians chapter 14, and what it says, and what he says there runs completely against the grain of modern worship culture. Let's think about this a little bit. Emotion is a response to truth, not a test of truth. Read the passage carefully. Paul doesn't ask, did you feel powerful? He asks, was it understood? He says, except you utter by the tongue words easy to be understood, how shall it be known what is spoken? That's not a suggestion, it's a rebuke. When emotion becomes the authority, clarity becomes optional. If it feels spiritual, it must be right. If it moves people, it must be of God. But the Bible never tells us to measure worship by sensation. Truth governs emotion. Emotion does not govern truth. Some people think chaos equals authenticity. If it sounds spontaneous, unpredictable, and overwhelming, then God must be moving. But Paul says the opposite. He flatly states God is not the author of confusion. And that means confusion doesn't come from God, no matter how sincere it feels. Now let's be honest. A confused service can still feel intense. A confused service can still draw a crowd. A confused service can still produce tears. But none of that proves God is pleased. Confusion excites the senses. Clarity strengthens the soul. Paul keeps using one word again and again, edify. That means build up, strengthen, prepare. And here's the hard truth. You cannot be built up by what you do not understand. You may be stirred, you may be impressed, you might be entertained, but you won't be equipped. And that's why Paul uses the trumpet illustration. If the sound is uncertain, nobody prepares for battle. Emotion alone doesn't prepare believers to face temptation, false doctrine, suffering, or sin. Clarity does. The gospel is clear. Man is a sinner. Christ died for sin. He rose again. Salvation is by grace through faith. But emotional worship often pushes the gospel to the margins. It becomes assumed, implied, or really completely overshadowed by atmosphere. People leave feeling closer to God, but unable to explain what sin is, why Christ died, or how salvation works. And that's not spiritual depth, that's spiritual fog. The lost don't need to be overwhelmed, they need to understand. Paul says plainly that when unbelievers walk into confusion, they conclude the church has lost its mind. And that hasn't changed. Here's the problem with emotional replacement. Feelings fade, but truth remains. If worship trains people to chase feelings instead of truth, what happens when the feeling disappears? What happens when life hits hard, when prayers aren't answered, when emotions go silent? A faith built on emotion collapses under pressure. A faith built on truth stands. That's why Paul refuses to sacrifice clarity for excitement. Some people like clarity because clarity removes the illusion of depth. If no one understands what's happening, it must be profound, right? Well, that's wrong. Paul says even inanimate instruments are useless without distinction. Noise doesn't equal meaning. Profundity isn't complexity, it's accessibility. Truth belongs on the bottom shelf where everyone can reach it. Here's the real issue. When emotion replaces clarity, Scripture loses its governing role. Experience becomes the final authority. What feels right outweighs what is written. And once that happens, there's no anchor. Every service becomes a moving target. Every feeling becomes self-validating. Paul shuts that down. He demands that worship be governed by truth, understanding, and order, because those things protect the church. Can emotional worship replace biblical clarity? No. And when it tries, the church pays the price. God's not impressed by noise. The gospel is not helped by confusion. And believers are not strengthened by what they cannot understand. Emotion does belong in worship, but it must follow truth and not replace it. If the trumpet gives an uncertain sound, well, nobody prepares for battle. And a church that isn't prepared is a church already in trouble. If this challenged you, well, good. Truth is supposed to do that. For more Bible-centered teaching that values clarity, conviction, and understanding, visit marvinmckenzie.org. And let me ask you directly, has emotional experience replaced biblical clarity in your church? Leave a comment. Say it plainly. Let's talk about it.